So good to see you.
Nice to see you again, Rishabh. It's been a long time.
It's very, very good to see you, Ashwin, and I'm so glad that you recall.
No, I remember we did an event at a school. No, sorry, it was a hotel somewhere in Mud Island, and I remember talking to a lot. But it was a very interesting chat that we had after the event, and I was truly amazed at the sort of insights that you had. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Rishabh.
He was truly amazed at the fact that how 8, 9 years ago the boy couldn't comb his hair, and even 9 years later he's yet not managed to comb his hair. But I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation with you, because not just these 100 people who are watching, Ashwin, but the many thousands who are going to be getting this in their schools and colleges as a part of our role model series are going to be looking at you, and this time not through a book but actually through a video conversation. So I'm so delighted and so very happy that we're doing this.
I'm happy to be here, and let me tell you, I was hearing you before we started this conversation. It is pouring cats and dogs outside, and
I'm already feeling bad for myself that I was doing all of that in front of you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. As you rightly said, the one thing that we have right now is heavy downpour of rains and complete political instability. So let's see where these are going to be done.
And these are the two things that in Mumbai, unfortunately, one has to deal with. But for the very many who everybody of course knows him, but for the few who don't know him, let me just quickly do an introduction of the man that we have with us today. He's an MBA from Yale University, a college that refused to give me admission. So Ashwin, I'm going to take that up personally after this with you. But he's on a lighter note. But he's a man.
Don't worry.
He's a man who can show you in 13 steps how to become anything in life. The keeper of the Kala Chakras and the man who has the Krishna's key to the vault of Vishnu. Exploring the hidden elements of private India, this man will make you travel the Rosabal line as the magician of Mazda weaves his magic at every stop that you take. People say he's India's Dan Brown, but I would like to say that we should refer to Dan Brown as Europe's Ashwin Sanghi. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, please put your virtual hands together for the man, the legend, the author, Ashwin Sanghi.
Thank you, Rishabh. That is so kind of you. It's so sweet of you. And frankly, I'm just feeling humbled that you're saying all of this about me. At the end of the day, I'm nothing else but a storyteller. And you know, whatever few words of wisdom that I can possibly share with your audience today, I'm delighted to do that, and to also probably pick up a lot of wisdom from this audience and from you.
It's very kind of you again. Lots of humility, but let me start at the very outset of this series. So this series is basically for young people to get inspired, to choose their role models. So that's why we've partnered with the university called Parul University to bring you this series to all the young people who tune in regularly at 6 p.m. and look forward to getting a role model, because on one end they have me. So on the other end, we try to bring role models in. But let me ask you this, that you had a very successful family business, Ashwin, if I'm not wrong. And you traversed that journey from a family business to becoming an author, which most would not probably take, given the fact that you don't earn as many zeros when you move from one to the other. So what inspired you?
Those actually, you just simply earn zero. Mostly the life of a lekhak is to earn zero.
Ask me about it. I wrote one book, one copy sold.
So, yeah, but you know, it's an interesting sort of journey. As you know, if you read the Vault of Vishnu, there is a very interesting anecdote I've provided out there about the Silk Road and the merchants of Samarkand. And the merchants of Samarkand had a very interesting tradition. When a child was born in the home, they would touch a drop of glue to the palm of the child and a drop of honey to the tongue of the child. The idea the boy should grow up in order to become a very, very smooth and sweet-talking salesman who can sell pretty much anything to anyone. And he should have a sticky palm so that coins will stick to the palm when he grows up. So in that sense, if you really think about the merchants of Samarkand, The modern day equivalent would probably be the Jews or the Marwadis. And I grew up in a Marwadi household. And, in many, many homes, when a child is born, you have a recitation of the Bhagavad Gita, or you have a recitation from the Holy Quran, or maybe a psalm from the Bible. But in Marwari homes, there are only two important words, debit and credit. And the two words that were uttered into the left and the right ear, representing the two sides of the balance sheet. So that was the cultural context in which I was born. But while all of this was going on, there was one parallel influence in my life, and that was my maternal granduncle who lived in the city of Kanpur. He was not only a successful businessman, but was also a voracious reader and a wonderfully eloquent writer and poet, multilingual, spoke multiple languages, and he had this tradition of sending me one book every week to read. And very often I would ask him that, why do you do this? And he would say that, look, being born in a business family, your target is always going to be Lakshmi. But remember one thing, Lakshmi is very curious about where Saraswati is. If Saraswati is in this room, then Lakshmi wants to be in this room. And if Saraswati gets up and leaves this room, then Lakshmi also wants to follow her to find out in order to, where has Saraswati gone? So she's innately curious. And so the short way of attaining Lakshmi is by going after Saraswati, because chances are you're going to find Lakshmi where Saraswati is. And he said, if you're truly wise, then in the Hindu pantheon of gods, the only deity that can keep both the Devi on either side is Ganesh, who can keep Lakshmi on one side and Saraswati on another. So he said, if you want one piece of advice from me, live your life like Ganesh, which probably explains why I look the way I do. But the point, Rishabh, is that has been my objective in life, to be able to have a balance of both worlds, the world of wealth and the world of wisdom. So Nanaji was busy. I called him Nanaji, even though he was my maternal granduncle, and he would send me these books. And over his lifetime, he sent me a little over 300 books to read. Wow. And it was an eclectic bunch of books, War and Peace, or, for example, the Mahabharata retold by Raja Gopalchari, or Freedom at Midnight. I mean, you name it, autobiography of a yogi. There were so many books that were coming at me, and oftentimes I was too young to be able to appreciate them. But what the old man was doing was, he was in some ways rewiring my brain. Sure. And I didn't realize it, but at the reading that I was doing and the weekly letter that I would send him about what I had read and what I had absorbed, actually, in some ways, that was the starting point of the writing bug. I would say that probably then, I allowed it to slide, and I didn't even think about it for the next 20 odd years of my life. Continued my training in business, went for an MBA, came back, majored in finance, started working for the group. And then there was a chance incident that happened sometime around 2002, which is when I visited Kashmir. There is a tomb out there in the heart of Srinagar known as Zabal. The story, the folklore, the myth, the legend around it is that Jesus Christ survived the crucifixion, and that he came and sat down in Kashmir, which is where he died. This story, I have always had, I think last week you had my good friend Amish on this very platform. And this is something that we have spoken about at length. We as writers go out looking for stories, or do stories come looking for us? And this was a perfect example of a story that came looking. And for the next year or 2 years, I ended up reading 50 odd books on a particular subject, spoke to a dozen people on it, traveled a lot. And by the end of it, I was almost, you could say, a Wikipedia of sorts on this particular tomb and this particular subject. And that is when my wife suggested to me that, listen, you know so much about it. Why don't you write a book? That's how I got started. It was meant to be a one-off thing. And I didn't even know whether it would get published. And even the publishing journey is the stuff of 47 publishers and literary agents said no. It eventually did get published. And then eventually, of course, it led to a second book called Chanakya's Chant, which became an overnight hit. And then the rest, they say.
The rest is history. No, that's a wonderful journey, and if that journey leads somebody to become Lord Ganesh, I think everyone will be happy.
What I think at younger ages, and since we are talking about role models, I think the worry that I have is that our school system and our educational system prepares you for success, but it prepares you for failure. And this is the biggest drawback of our education system. And it's not just the education system in India, but almost everywhere. We don't understand that success is actually a series of failures and getting up from each of those failures. And as a result of which, at a young age, I find so many people. I mean, I can tell you, across my heart, I could possibly tell you that there are so many potential bestsellers that did not get published because someone or the other decided to give up after the first few rejections. Or got put off by the fact that a couple of literary agents wrote back and said, this is nonsense, you're never going to get published, or even if you get published, it's not going to sell. That's really where the worry is, not getting up.
Like you said, that 47 publishers you went through. And I'm so glad you shared that, because one of the things that I usually ask guests who come on this series, especially on this series, is that can you narrate a failure and can you tell us about a failure? Because otherwise role models always talk about success stories that, ye hua, baad mein ye hua. And like you rightly said, the Indian education system never talks about failure. It never talks about things which are important. And behind every success are 100 such failures. Like you said, the 47 publishers. But there's a very interesting thing that you also spoke about, which I want to touch upon. You said, you spoke about Amish, and then there's Devdutt, and there's yourself. And, we've been fortunate in the time span of a week, we had all three of you. But the idea, for different purposes, of course, but the idea that all of you invoke in young people who are watching, who are teenagers, and that I didn't have personally. When I was a teenager, I didn't have somebody who was writing extensively about.
You still look like a teenager. You are wise with your years, but you still look very, very young, I must say.
That's very, very kind of you. We must give this man the Pulitzer. but
taking off from where you were when I wrote the first book, The Rosabal Line, when I had my first press conference and there were a couple of journalists and they said, you're a businessman, a Marwadi businessman with training in finance and, you have an MBA without a BA in creative writing or an MA in literature or any of the normal literary stuff. What gives you the qualification of being a writer? And I said, during my growing up years, my mother would always say that I was a bloody good liar. I could tell with a straight face. Maybe
so the teenager.
Maybe you need to take my compliment with a pinch of salt.
So now every compliment that you give, I'm going to actually check whether it's a compliment or it's not. But one thing that I must compliment you on, which comes from my heart, is the fact that you have invoked interest in India, that is Bharat. At one point in time, without your Bharat series, without the works of the people that I mentioned, young people were not as enamored by what is happening in India, or for that matter, about what India or Bharat is all about. Now, there was heavy Anglicization, and I have nothing against it. I've studied in an English medium school in an urban precinct called South Bombay, and I've been as westernized as they come. But the point being that, Ashwin, that I'm trying to make is the fact that when you're stitching together these stories, sometimes I feel, And not sometimes I feel there are newer people who are writing about India and who are writing about Bharat, and then sometimes there is seem to be peddling more narratives in comparison to actually rediscovering what India stood for, whether it's through mythology, and one may accept, that it's through mythology and it's not through facts per se, but now the rediscovering of India through the books and through the tales that one is weaving seems to have a political connotation. Do you think that this is something that you've experienced yourself, or do you think that I'm reading far too much into things that I shouldn't be reading?
No, I think you're both right and wrong. I think in some ways there is a general sort of veering in terms of the political spectrum. But think about this, that a book like The Rosabal Line got published in 2007 or 2008, which was a completely different political dispensation. So I think if I'm not mistaken, the first book of Amish, which was The Immortals of Meluha, must have come out maybe a year or a year and a half later, sometime around 2009, 2010. So honestly speaking, these stories were not inspired by any sort of political
Correct.
that was going on.
Correct.
But yes, I do believe that what has happened, unfortunately, in India is that from 1947, the stuff that we as youngsters have been exposed to, unfortunately, has been of a particular dispensation. Which means, in other words, even for example, our history, the way we have been taught history, is a unidimensional way of looking at it. By that, I mean that, take for example, right now, a good friend of mine, Vikram Sampath, he recently wrote these two beautiful volumes on Savarkar. The amount of heat that those books have generated is truly incredible. And I myself am flabbergasted that, why should there be such a violent reaction to simply an alternate view on history?
Correct.
And it was George Santana who said that history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, written by people who were never there. In that sense, history is simply a version of events. And this is a country which has fundamentally had a dharmic ethos. What do I mean by that? I mean that we can have 33 million days which lead to a singular truth. Uh, it means that you can worship Shiva or Shakti or a combination of both. It means that you can put Jesus Christ on the facade of a Hindu temple. It
Correct.
means that you can call a stone a shivling and I can call your shivling a stone. And both of us are welcome. You may see the path as yantra, tantra, mantra, or none of the above. You could be astic, nastic, you could be an idol worshipper, a fire worshipper, you could be a nature worshipper. We are all welcome. This is pluralism at its best, at its finest. This is very distinct and separate from Abrahamic, which says there is one truth. And if you do not follow this single truth, then you are damned in the hellfires of eternity. So if we are essentially dharmic, and if we can have 300 versions of the Ramayana, your version does not negate my version of the Ramayana, then in that case, why do we not exhibit the same pluralism towards concepts like history, where you can have an event in 1850, which we are taught as the Great Rebellion of 1857. On the other hand, that same event in English history books is taught as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. Which is the right version? To my mind, the only way to teach history, and anyone who says that history is free of biases doesn't know what they're talking about. History is yesterday's politics, and politics is today's history. As simple as that. So all history has the fundamental issue of a narrator's bias, which means, in other words, that how do you eliminate that? And the only eliminate is to allow multiple narratives to flourish, which means that the way you go and see a movie, a 3D movie in the cinema, you put on a pair of glasses, 3D glasses and you have multiple beams of light coming at you, and yet you are able to reconstruct it into a coherent whole. That's what you should be doing with history. And that is really where my peeve is. The reason why you see so many different flourishing narratives today is because they have been repressed for so long.
I understand what you're saying. And then after all, history is written by the victors, right? History is something that is penned down by the one who's won. So which is why automatically you're going to get one-sided versions of what happened in 1857 for that matter. So, and what you said was very interesting, and I remember that line forever. You said, history is yesterday's politics, and politics is today's history. And
yes, if you look back at today's times, this is what is going to be written up in terms of history. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's for anyone to say that, oh, listen, I like this particular narrator's version because this particular narrator has had an unbiased version of the event. They don't know what they're talking about. It's impossible.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, what you're saying is so true, and I'm so glad you touched upon it. I'll say this clip also to a few politicians. But there are many from IIMUN who've actually gone on and joined these different political parties, and they must hear what you're saying because it makes so much sense. There is no absolute truth, and that's what Bharat is all about. The fact that your truth, my truth, and somebody else's truth are all yet acceptable, and there is no one truth. But there is this one very fascinating part about Bharat that you've written about in your latest book, The Magicians of Mazda. And I'm most excited to hear about this community for one simple reason, because out of our board, that is our board that looks after IIMUN, we've got a Shamak Davar, we've got a Farooq Khavarana, we've got, we've got Mr. Godrej, there is also Nazli Wadia, and a whole bunch, Baman Irani, and a bunch of these people, plus the likes of Cyrus Brocha have always been associated to us. But it's a community of 60,000, Ashwin. It's a community of 60,000 as per the 2011 census. And yet they have this kind of impact on India. What is so special about this community? And tell us a little more about your book.
So essentially, I found this story very fascinating because, as you rightly said, if you take just for example Bombay, the count would be about 40,000. All India would be about 60,000. All over the world would be about 100,000. And yet you look at this entire community and you say, what the sort of impact that they've had on the world of business, on the world of politics, on the world of literature, on the world of science, on the world of medicine, on the world of law. It's incredible. It's an oversized impact vis-a-vis the sort of minuscule minority that they are. But having said that, I just thought to myself, I said, this was at one point of time in Iran, what we now know as Iran, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. This was at one point of time the greatest civilization that ever existed. The Sassanid Empire was a Zoroastrian empire. And they had some of the most incredible wise men from all over the world to the academy at Kundeshapur, where people from China and India were sharing knowledge. They had Greek physicians and historian pastors, everyone coming in order to be share this wonderful flood of knowledge, as it were. And how did this particular community be brought to a situation where in the 7th century they had to flee and eventually come to the Gujarat coastal city of Sanjan, first to Diu, then to Sanjan. To a very great extent, my personal view is that this is a case study in civilization. And this is what I wanted to bring up through the book. That listen, for those of you who make fun of those of us who talk about civilization, listen, please remember that today, for example, go back to Greece and all the old Greek gods have ceased to exist. Go back to Egypt, Ra and Osiris and Isis don't exist anymore. They've been taken over. Go to Australia, the original Aboriginal faiths all disappeared. these in I mean, the point is that if you simply go back in history, you realize that once flourishing civilizations have ceased to exist. And this is what is great about Bharat. We are probably one of the few pre-Bronze Age civilizations that continue to exist and continue to survive against all odds. You owe it to Bharat to preserve that civilization, to preserve that ethos. And that is really what I've tried to bring out through the
No, I'm excited. I'm excited now that you tell me much more about this. This was any which way in my reads coming up, like the books that I have to read. But I'm going to shift it up in the pecking order and pick it up sooner. But
I'm honored. I'm honored.
Well, I want a signed copy the next time I see you. But before that, but Ashwin, the children are going to be watching this. There's going to be schools who are going to be playing this in their school assemblies, right? And the idea that Magicians of Mazda also speaks about a community, like you said, like it also talks about a community which has contributed so significantly. Tell us something that the students should look up to, look forward to in terms of reading your book when it comes to things that are not found in their normal history books. What will they find in this book which they normally don't find in the history?
I think, Rishabh, you are a Bombay boy. I am also a South Mumbai product. Both of us went to Anglican schools. And
briefly to the same school, by the way, and briefly to the same school.
Okay. So, the point I'm making is that we forget that Bombay required, from the 1600s onwards, when it was first gifted by the Spanish to the English, and then eventually became part of the East India Company, and then the Governor General, a guy called Gerald Angier, was sent to Bombay in order to actually start filling up the islands and the swamps in order to create what we now know as Bombay. We forget that had it not been for many of those early Parsis who came to Bombay, Bombay would not have existed. One of the first things that Angier did very wisely was to create the Tower of Silence in Malabar Hill, as well as set up the first fire temple so that he could get many of the Parsis who were at that time traders in Surat to come and settle in Bombay. The greatest shipping fortunes were built by Parsi families, which not only lived in Bombay, but also lived in China. The greatest textile mill owners were Parsis. The starting of the political movements were, the first members of the Indian National Congress were Parsis. So the very first Indian member of the British Parliament, Dadabhai Nauroji, was a Parsi. So the point is that this was a community, but what explains their success was the fact that they were always ready to adapt. I think this being nimble-footed seems to be one very important thing that comes across from this community. For example, when they landed in Sanjan, the Hindu Raja, a guy called Jadi Rana, who we now know as the Chalukya king Vijayaditya, when he greeted them, he gave them a bowl of milk, and he said the milk was completely full in the bowl. And they returned it to him with a little bit of sugar in the milk in order to indicate that your kingdom may be full, we won't occupy too much of space. And they only took a few farsangs of land from him and agreed to adapt entirely to his ways in terms of their dress, their language, their customs, and so on and so forth. But in other words, you see how quick they were in terms of being able to adapt themselves to the Gujarat culture. Similarly, you see how quick they were in terms of being, when the Sultan of Gujarat, Mahmud Begada, attacked Sanjan, which was about 400 years later. This was a community that had renounced weapons in order to be able to get safe haven in Gujarat. And here they were called by the new king and said, take up arms. And here they fought alongside the Hindu warriors in order to fight the Islamic forces at that point in time. Again, adapting. Then you see the number of times that they had to take their holy Iran, the fire, from one place to another until it eventually found a place at Udvada. Adaptation. Uh, you see their ability to be able to adapt to Surat, where they suddenly realized the old maritime routes lay along that entire stretch, and so therefore they could again go back to being merchants, adapting again, and then adapting from Surat to Bombay, where most of them, unlike the upper caste Hindus who were the main businessmen at that time, who had huge issues about getting polluted and crossing the seven seas, and what sort of food they would have. As far as the Bawas were concerned, hey, then all pollution gets taken care of by whiskey and gin. So they were available to everyone, and they spoke multiple languages, and as a result of which they were able to encash on that opportunity of being able to do business with the British. So if you really think about it, what really explains their success to a very great extent is the fact that they have been nimble-footed and they have been quick to it.
They've been very nimble-footed, and I'm the way that they've actually, they've become a part of Indian society and now contributed so much to Indian society, like you said, like from the legal field all the way to the business domain, and then it's disproportionate to the number of Parsis that exist, and therefore I'm so glad that you've touched upon this. This is the subject of your book, so to say, and to that end, Ashwin, let me ask you this as well: that when young people are looking forward, they're going to be looking forward to reading your book after this conversation, I'm pretty sure. But when they're going through this, and this is something that's going through your book, and I'm sure it's not going to be in your book, but in some other books, like I touched upon even earlier, is the concept that they try to find in these books and in people role models. Now, in your book, hopefully we'll find the right role models and we'll find the right people to look up to, so to say. But today's day and age, unfortunately, the role models of today are not necessarily, like, one of the things that I missed out on is beautiful authors such as you in my teenage years. But another thing that I feel really bad about for the current crop is the role models that I had and the role models that are there today. They're very strong cult-like personalities in all domains, whether you look at the field of cricket, whether you look at the field of Bollywood, or you look at politics. I grew up with a Rahul Dravid who could easily, he took up keeping for the Indian cricket team. Of course, I'm sure you're nodding your head, so you're a cricket fan as well. So I grew up with those role models. Now, what would you tell young people? What would you tell young people who are looking for a role model, or what are the qualities that one should look for in role models per se when you're choosing a role model?
Well, I mean, to my mind, the qualities that at least personally I have always found interesting. I believe I am enticed by those sort of characters. The ones who have refused to say no. The ones who sort of, it was the investor Mark Cuban who said, every no brings me closer to a yes. So I think that is so important in your life, to be able to simply get up. In Japan, they have what is known as a Daruma doll. And this Daruma doll is basically a monk. I don't know how many of the audience out here are aware that, the Shaolin monastery, there was a monk by the name of Bodhidharma. And Bodhidharma was the one who took ancient Indian martial arts from the Pallava kingdom to Shaolin. He took Silambam and Kalaripaya too. And it was these martial arts which eventually evolved into Kung Fu. And then when Bodhidharma began to be talked about in Japan, then he began to be called Daruma. And it is the myth grew around Daruma that he sat in meditation in a cave for 9 years, to the point where eventually his legs fell in atrophy because he had sat for 9 years. As a result of which, in Japan, they have what is known as a Daruma doll. Though Bodhidharma came to be known as Daruma in Japan. And in Japan, they have the Daruma doll, which doesn't have, it only has a round bottom. so that you can punch it as many times as you like, but it bounces back. So for me, the ideal role model is one who has lived life like Dharma. Take, for example, someone like an Amitabh Bachchan, who went through so many flops before he eventually got a success. Or, for example, ended up dealing with a company, ABCL, which went out of business, bankrupted him. Again came back, said, never say die. Kaun banega crorepati happened, and then suddenly his fortunes got revived. A person who was on the brink of death after the shooting of Coolie. So these are the sort of people, not because he's a Bollywood superstar, but because of that never say die attitude. I think those should be role models, number one. I think the second thing that I look for in role models is basically the ones who understand. I've always, when I do these lectures, a lot of people ask me, you are a successful writer. What do you think is your version of so-called being lucky? And I said, hey, listen, if you are lucky in your life, you get to do what you love. If you're slightly luckier, then you get to do what you love and you're actually good at it. And if you are really lucky, then you get to do what you love, you're also good at it, and someone's willing to pay you for it. Then, so to my mind, the ones who are willing to hone their skill, so one, persistence, but second, perseverance. You have what is known as that so-called 10,000 hour rule, which means that you simply keep on and on and on. When people ask me, do you think this is your best book? I say, no, my best book is not. Because with every book, all I'm looking to do is here to on that. This, to my mind, is very important. The first being perseverance, the second being persistence, and the third and most important quality that I look for in a role model is that it's very easy to deal with failure, but it's even more difficult to deal with success. And I see so many people who go completely, out of this world, almost as if they are flying, because they've seen a modicum of success. To my mind, Rishabh, even if you decide to become an author and you get published and the book becomes a bestseller, no, you, as in any of your audience, just keep your feet on the ground. Remember that every word that you put on that piece of paper was not yours. It was a boon from Ma Saraswati. You were simply a medium, and retain that humility to be able to thank Saraswati for having put you there. So I think humility is all important. Without that, we are.
No, and that is, I think, out of the three qualities that you mentioned, if I were to pick one, is that young people achieve overnight success, especially in the day and age of instant gratification, Ashwin. And the fact that today you have overnight billionaires, you have unicorn valuations, you have influencers, and you taste success at a very young age. And because they taste success at a very young age, I think the most important thing for them to look for a role model, and even for me, is how to keep ourselves grounded, just like how Rahul Dravid did, just like how Ashwin Sanghi did, and just like how Mr. Bachchan did. And that's something that we at IIMUN should get more young people to be attuned to. And therefore, I'm very grateful that you've taken out this time. But let me ask you this one thing. In your book, and I must keep coming back to your book because I'm very fascinated about Parsis. And when the whole thing happened, and they said, he's coming out with a book, and I said, this is fantastic because. Are there any characters that are central to your book who would be great role models who have all of these three things?
Well, think about it. Today, for example, take for example someone like, let's say, Jamshedji Tata. Was almost on the verge of bankruptcy. In his quest to create a steel plant. And the British joked, that the only thing that his steel used for is are the nails in his coffin. I mean, you imagine, and of course they didn't realize that Parsis don't need coffins, and as a result of which they don't even need nails. because they go through sky burials. But the point that against all odds, you see that lifetime playing out. Or you take someone like, say, for example, Freddie Mercury. I mean, here is a person who has huge gender issues, is not in a position to be able to so-called quote unquote come out. And on the other hand, this person becomes the icon of the music world. I mean, and that too, doing something which is so remarkably different to what his family would have wanted him to do. So, I mean, there are countless examples like that. To my, even if we were to look at some of the early shipping magnates, or we were to look at, take the astrologer Bijan Daruwala. I mean, come on. Who would imagine that there would be a Parsi who is looking at the astrological charts? I mean, or for example, I mean, the Magicians of Mazda was launched by both Cyrus Brocha and Baman Irani. And
Really?
Again is one of those where, a boy coming from a humble business family, selling potato chips, decides that he's going to go and spend his afternoons watching movies. And his family is totally against the idea. But then eventually makes a break into the big bad world of cinema. There are countless examples, Rishabh.
So in your book, is there any one specific example? The last time I'll ask you that question and move on to my last question.
No, I think, as you know, The Magicians of Mazda is a fictional narrative.
Of course.
The protagonist is a scientist by the name of Jim Dastur, who is looking for a miraculous cure to all diseases, and as a result of which he is hounded all over the world. He ends up getting kidnapped and taken to Iran because apparently there are some ancient linkages with the Zoroastrian traditions that come to him, which eventually leads him from Iran into Afghanistan and finally Kashmir. So it's a chase, it's a global chase, as it were, but it all leads back into ancient Persepolis. It links back into the ancient Mesopotamian region. It links back into the Fertile Crescent. It links back into what we now know as the area of Asia, which was Bactria and Balkh. So there are lots and lots of linkages, but the one that comes across from Jim Dastur is the fact that at the end of the day, in India, we have this old proverb. It is called dawa and dua. So ultimately, you not only need, who was it who said that every great scientist must also be a philosopher, and every great philosopher must also be a scientist. So dawa and dua is really the central tenet that Jim Dastur works on, which is what he eventually attains. How is he combine science and spirituality? Because there is, I mean, if you now go back, I don't know if you had read a previous book of mine called Keepers of the Kal Chakra.
I have.
I genuinely believe that when our ancient seers were looking up into the heavens, and when they were looking within themselves, they were exploring pretty much the same phenomena that the scientists who are now looking into quantum theory are attempting to explain. The very idea of nothing, the very idea of space-time, the very idea of inwardness being a facet of outwardness, all of this, these concepts were being explored by these guys. So I think that is the central takeaway from the Magicians of.
Is the central takeaway from the Magicians of Mazda, and probably James Dastur is the guy who is the role model that we're all looking for? Is he the dua and dawa of the world? Which is what I was trying to get to, which is what I wanted you to say, but I'm glad that we touched upon this. My final question to you, Ashwin, before we let you go is, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the following words? All right, it's a very good friend and mentor of mine who runs a very popular Bollywood show, which is going to now start on 7th of July. I'm doing a free plug-in for Karan, you should tell him. But of course, there is no be hamper at the end of it. But what's the first thought that comes to your mind when I say the following words, Ashwin? When I say magicians of Mazda, what's the first thought that comes?
Uh, Dava, Dua.
When I say Bharat,
Civilization, dharmic philosophy.
when I say role model,
Humility, persistence, perseverance.
youth,
Oh, the world. The world is your oyster.
the world is your, and the last one, IIMUN. When I say IIMUN, what's the first thought that comes to mind?
Knowledge. What you are doing, you don't realize the number of people that you are reaching and the number of people that you are influencing. I think you're doing a yeoman service to the youth of our country, because you're giving them the greatest gift that you can possibly give them, which is the gift of Saraswati.
But all you told me, you warned me at the outset of the show. You said all storytellers are very good liars, and therefore I must be must tread with caution. But
So it is true that storytellers are spinners of yarns. So fiction writers have to be good liars. There is a corollary to that proverb, and the corollary is that if you are going to tell a lie, then tell that lie as close to the truth as possible, because then it makes the lie sound very believable. And in the world of fiction, for example, what I do in order to make my lie sound believable is I try and tell my lie close to the truth. That's why I'm very often called a conspiracy writer, or that I sort of write in the space of what if. The Rosamund line, the what if story about could Jesus Christ have lived in Kashmir, or the Krishna key was a what if story that could the Mahabharata have actually happened, and could it have overlapped with the Saraswati civilization, or for example, Chanakya's chant was a what if, that what if you had a modern day politician who tried to adapt the Arthashastra to today's polity, so that the most delicious question that we can ask ourselves is what if, and that is what I attempt to do with my books. So even though you may take a lot of what I'm saying as a lie, because I'm supposed to be a bloody good liar, just remember that my lie is always peppered with a lot of factual information in order to try and tell that lie as close as possible to the truth.
No. I'm simply stating the things that you said at the start of the show. I have utmost respect, and it's a lot of fun chatting with you. But Ashwin, I'll let you go as well. You've been very kind. You've spent a lot of time with us, and you've basically chatted about a whole bunch of issues. But the key takeaway, personally, from me, from all of what you said, was 47 books, 47 publishers that you wrote to, and 47 of them said, no, we can't publish Ashwin Sanghi. And then eventually you were perseverant enough, you kept writing, and you eventually made it from Sean Higgins to the Ashwin Sanghi that we know today. And the best part about you is you're the same humility that I knew 7 years ago when you walked in without 15, 20 people walking before and after you. You came in, with simple, I think it was a shirt and trousers that you wore, and you came in and you delivered the talk. And there were all students who stood up and started clapping. And I'm pretty sure all the ones who are watching today and who will watch this conversation will do the same. It's wonderful to be able to have role models such as you. Thank you for joining on IIMUN's Role Models.
Thank you, Rishabh. I'm delighted that you invited me, and thank you for giving me this platform. Thank you for inviting me to something which probably is going to be a very important, I would say in some ways, just a takeaway for a lot of kids that don't get disheartened by failure. Just treat it as a series of missteps which will eventually. That's the only takeaway that I would hope that they would have from this particular conversation. And not only my life, but your life is a very good indication of that.
I'm following the 13 steps to success. But that's but again, success is of course very relative, and to that end, one should keep their feet always on the ground. Much for me to do, but I'm glad that we have people such as you. Thank you very much, Ashwin, and I will see you very, very soon from hopefully that chair in South Bombay to our headquarters with a lot of young people in South Bombay very soon. Thank you, Ashwin.
Thank you. Take care.